In this video, I'll show you how to get started with sculpting for complete beginners in Blender. So I'll show you how you can set up Blender for sculpting, and then I'll be covering all the basic tools and the basic brushes for sculpting. And then after I show you the basics of sculpting in Blender, we'll be doing a sculpting exercise by sculpting this cute fish character. And then I'll also show you a cool painting option in Blender Sculpt mode where you can paint some colors on the fish. And if you'd like to download these free project files of the finished fish here, then you can download the project files for free on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. Now, if you've never used Blender before and you're a complete beginner to Blender, then you may want to watch a complete beginner tutorial series just to learn the very basics of the program and navigating around the program and the basic shortcut keys and basic 3D modeling. So if you'd like to learn all the basics of Blender, then definitely check out my complete Blender beginner tutorial series. It's a 14-part tutorial series and it's all completely free on my YouTube channel, but in this video I'll just be covering the basics of the sculpting part of Blender. And after you watch this video, if you find that you really enjoy sculpting and you want to get more into sculpting, then I can highly recommend checking out CG Boost's course, Master 3D Sculpting in Blender. So that's a much larger course on sculpting, and it goes into so much more depth into sculpting. So in the course, you'll learn all the sculpting basics, like the different brushes, the different tools, and sculpting workflows. And the course also has some different beginner exercises which you can follow along to get better at sculpting. You'll also learn some cool techniques for creating base meshes for your sculpts. And then the course covers the entire process of creating this cute creature character. So after this video, if sculpting is something that you want to get more into, then I highly recommend checking out the sculpting course by CG Boost. And if you purchase the course through my affiliate link in the description, then I'll earn a small commission, so that's also a great way to help support this channel. Now before we get into sculpting, I'd highly recommend using a drawing tablet if you're able to, because drawing tablets make sculpting so much easier and it can really improve your sculpts. Now if you're just getting started with sculpting and you want to just try it out and see if you like sculpting, then you can definitely use a mouse, but it's much harder to sculpt with a mouse, so I'd highly recommend using a drawing tablet if you're able to. And so in this video, I'm going to be using this small Wacom pad tablet, so it's not anything fancy, it's not a display tablet or anything, it's just a small pad tablet which I can just plug into my computer, and then I look at my monitor, and then the pad tablet is down on my desk, and I just sculpt using the pen. And using a drawing tablet is much better for sculpting because you're able to have a much better posture, you're able to make nice smooth strokes with the pen, and most drawing tablets have pen pressure, so you're able to use the pen pressure to make, for instance, the brush size thicker or the brush strength stronger. And if you're interested in purchasing a drawing tablet, then I do have some Amazon links in the description to some tablets that I recommend, and those are affiliate links, so if you purchase something through those links, then I'll earn a small commission, but with no extra cost to you. Now when you're doing sculpting in Blender, you need to start off with a high poly mesh for the sculpting, because if I just hit the tab key to go into edit mode of this cube here, when you're sculpting, it pulls around the geometry of the mesh to actually sculpt the mesh. So if I were to try to sculpt with a very low poly object like this cube, I wouldn't be able to sculpt much detail because this model is so low poly, because it has a vertex here and then another one here, but it doesn't have any vertices in between them. So what I'm going to do is press the A key to select everything in the scene, and I'll hit X, and let's just click on delete. So I'll now press Shift A for the add menu, and I'm going to go down here to mesh, and I'm just going to add an icosphere because an icosphere is nice and smooth and round and it's very detailed. However, you can see this is kind of low poly, so if I click right behind me on the add icosphere settings, I'm going to click on the arrows here just to turn up the icosphere settings, and I'm just going to turn up really high to like a 7. If that's a bit laggy for you, you don't have to turn up that high, but I'm going to turn up to a 7 so it is nice and smooth and round. And then I can click here to close the add icosphere settings. So now we can go to Blender's sculpt mode, because right now we are just in the object mode. So there are two ways to get to Blender's sculpt mode. You can just select the object, and then you can click here in the corner and you can change it from object mode to sculpt mode. But what I prefer to do is to click right here to go to Blender's sculpting workspace. And this will automatically take you into sculpt mode of the object that you have selected. So you can see right here it's taken us into sculpt mode, but it's also showing us now the different settings for sculpting right here. It has some more settings up here for sculpting, and then right over here you can see we have the panel with the brushes. So I like to jump to the sculpting workspace so everything's already set up. Now just so you're aware, all of these settings right here and all these different panels, all of these settings are the same settings which are right over here. For example, you can see there is the radius and the strength. So the radius is the size of your brush and the strength is how strong it is, and those settings are also right here. So we have the strength and also the radius. Then there's this Dyn Topo setting right here, and this setting is also right down here. So these settings here and also the settings on the side panel are the same. But then right over here on the left side, we have all these sculpting brushes. Now before we get into the brushes, I want to go over basic navigation. So I have my drawing tablet on my desk right in front of me, and then I also have my keyboard a little bit higher up above my tablet. And I'm going to put my hand over the Shift and Control keys because the Shift and Control keys are very common buttons that you'll use when you're sculpting. Now you can change the settings of your tablet in the driver settings or on the graphics tablet settings on your computer. However, I've just left everything at the default, so the shortcut keys should work the same if you've just left everything at the default. Now usually the tablet pens will come with a back button and a front button. So to zoom in, I'm going to hold down the Control key and then click and drag with the front pen button. Now I'm not actually pressing down with my tablet. I'm not actually pushing the pen down on the surface. I'm just hovering my pen over the surface and then I'm clicking with the front pen button. So hold down the Control key and then click with the front pen button, and you can click and drag to zoom in and out. But again, my pen is just hovering over the surface, but it's not actually pressing down on the drawing tablet. Now if you don't hold down the Control key and you just click with the front pen button, that is going to orbit around, so I can look around the sphere. Now if you hold down the Shift key and then click and drag with the front pen button, that is going to pan around, so I can move over here to the right side and move around here to the left side. Now another way to zoom around your sculpt is to hold down the Alt key and then just click with the front pen button, and you can see wherever I'm clicking, that's going to kind of zoom over to that area. Now to actually sculpt on the digital clay, we're not actually going to use the pen buttons, we're actually going to press down on our tablet. So you can just click and then just drag around and then press down on your tablet and it's going to add clay. Now once you've sculpted on an area, if you want to zoom into that specific area, you can hit the period key on the keyboard and that's going to zoom into that specific area. So if I want to like sculpt over here, I can sculpt there by just pressing down on the tablet and then hit the period key, and you can see now it's going to zoom into this location. So if I just orbit around by clicking with the front pen button and then just moving my pen over the tablet surface, you can see we've zoomed into that area. So again, if I just press down on the tablet and draw, that is going to add clay. Now if you want to get rid of clay, so if you want to push the clay back in instead of pulling it out, you can hold down the Control key. So if I hold down the Control key and then just sculpt here, you can see it's pushing in the clay instead of bringing it out. Now if you don't want to hold down the Control key, you can instead click on the minus button. So now that it's set to the minus button, if I just click and sculpt along here, you can see it's going to push in the clay. Then if I click back here to the plus, now I can just sculpt and it's going to bring out the clay. So let's now go over the different brushes. So I'm not going to go over every single brush because this is a beginner tutorial and there's no point in overwhelming you with all the brushes. Most of the brushes I actually don't use. There's probably just like 5 brushes that I use most of the time. So I'll just be going over the main brushes that I think you need to know. Now the brush which is on default here is the draw brush. And if you want to make this bigger so you can see all the names of the brushes, you can click and drag out here in the corner and that is going to make it bigger, and now you can see there's all the different names of the brushes. Or if you want to collapse them, you can click and drag and make this smaller. You can also make it really small if you just want to have one row of brushes, or you can completely close it. But I'll just leave this how it is. I like how it is with 2 rows of brushes. So the first one here is the draw brush, and this is the default brush, and you can see it's just going to make a little blob of clay, kind of like a little hump there. Now the next most common brush that you'll probably use is the clay strips brush, and the clay strips brush is basically going to add layers of clay. Now, I also want to show you the strength and the radius because you can see this is kind of small right now. So right here you have the strength, so you can drag this up and down. So if I turn it way up all the way to 1, now if I sculpt here, you can see it's going to be a lot stronger. Or if I make this really low, now if I sculpt here, you can see it's barely adding any detail. So I'll turn this up pretty high. Maybe I'll turn this up to like a 0.7, so it's kind of stronger. Then we also have the radius here, so I can drag up the radius, and now if I start to go along here, you can see we're adding in much larger layers of clay. Now there is shortcut keys for the radius and the strength. So if you press the F key, then you can drag your pen bigger or smaller, and then just click to confirm that, and that's going to change the size of the brush. So F, make it really big, click, and then you can just sculpt along there. Now the radius is Shift F. So if you press Shift F, now you can see it's going to show you how strong it is by this number here and also how dark it is. So if I turn it like all the way up to 1, now you can see the strength is going to be a lot bigger. Or again, if I press Shift F, I can make this really small, maybe just like a 0.1, and now you can see it's going to be very subtle. So again, F to change the size and Shift F to change the radius, but if that's too hard to remember, you can easily just change the strength and the radius right here. Now, while we're talking about the strength and the radius, I also want to talk about the pen pressure. So most tablets will come with a pen pressure. So basically, that is a sensitivity in the pen, which is going to detect how hard you are pressing the pen down on the tablet. And this is another reason why using a drawing tablet is so much better than using a mouse for sculpting, because you can use the pen pressure. Now, if you click on this button here, that is going to turn on the pen pressure. So right now, we'll just leave it on here for the strength. So now that the pen pressure is enabled, if I just push down really lightly, you can see it's only adding a little bit of clay. But if I push down really hard, now you can see it's adding a lot more clay. And if I just make my brush a bit smaller, let me zoom out here, I can start by pressing down really lightly, and then I can slowly press down harder and harder, and you can see it's going to be really strong, and then I can slowly press down lighter and lighter, and it's going to get less strong. So that's super useful. Let's turn this off by clicking on this button. Now the other one is the radius. So if I click on this button here, that'll turn on the pen pressure, and now if I start to sculpt here, you can see it's really small, and then if I press down harder, you can see it'll get much bigger, and then I can press down just a little bit and it'll get much smaller. So this is useful for making really nice organic looking strokes. Now usually when I'm sculpting, I like to have the radius turned off, but I like to have the strength turned on. That's just how I like it, but you could also turn on both of them. And now if you turn on both of them, when you press down harder, it'll get stronger and bigger. And if you press down lighter, then it'll get smaller and less strong. So you can definitely do that if you want to. You can really do whatever you want. And as you're sculpting, you can also turn them on and off depending on what you're working on. But I'm going to keep the radius turned off and the strength turned on. All right, so let's go back over the brushes now. So the next brush that I want to show you is the crease brush. So this is a super common one. So if I just zoom in here, let's say that I want to make a bit of a crease here. Let me just make my brush bigger. I can just go along here and you can see it's basically going to pinch in the clay and kind of add a crease there. So I can just go along here and kind of add a nice crease there. Now, if you want to bring it out instead, you can again hold down the control key as you are sculpting. And when you hold down the control key, again, just like I showed you for the draw brush, it's going to do the opposite effect. So you can see if I'm holding down the control key, instead of it creasing it in, it's going to kind of pinch it out and make like a little sharp bump there. And the same thing works for the clay strips brush. If I just normally sculpt, it'll sculpt out. But if I hold down the control key, you can see it's going to sculpt in. Let's go to another super common brush, which is the smooth brush. And this is super useful for smoothing out your sculpt after you've sculpted, because you can see right here, if you kind of zoom in, you can see all the topology there and it maybe looks a little bit rough. So let me just make my radius bigger. So now I can just lightly go along here using that smooth brush. And you can see it's going to smooth out the clay and make it look a lot nicer. Now, the smooth brush is so commonly used that there's actually a shortcut for it. Now, there are actually shortcuts for all the brushes. If you just hover your mouse over the brushes, you can see it's going to show you a shortcut. So you can see like this one, the shortcut is V. So if I hit V, that'll go to the draw brush, and there's different shortcut keys for all of them. I usually just click over here to click on each one of the brushes. However, the smooth brush is used so often that if you hold down the shift key, that's going to automatically switch over to the smooth brush. And then if you let go of the shift key, that'll remove the smooth brush and bring it back to the brush that you were using before. So for example, let's say I'm using clay strips brush. I'm going to go along here and I'm just going to sculpt some layers of clay. So let's say I want to smooth this out. Well, instead of clicking here to the smooth brush, I can just hold down the shift key and it will automatically turn my brush into the smooth brush, and I can go along here and just smooth it out. But then as soon as I let go of the shift key, it'll go back to the brush that I was using before. So I can add a bunch of clay here, hold down the shift key, and then just lightly go along here and kind of smooth it out. And then I can just go back to using the clay strips brush. Now, another common brush that you might use is the inflate brush, and this is going to do exactly what the name says. So if I just go along here, you can see it's basically going to inflate whatever I'm sculpting. So it's basically making it lumpy and kind of popping it out. Now, another cool brush that you might use a lot is the scrapes brush. So for this, let me again just make my brush a bit bigger. So I'll press the F key, make it bigger. So with the scrapes brush, it's basically going to flatten it out and kind of scrape away the clay. So if I want to make this smooth, you can see if I go along here, it's kind of just like flattening it out. It's almost like I'm scraping away the clay and making little sharp points. So I can just go along here, kind of push that away and kind of flatten that all out and kind of scrape away the clay. And then another super useful brush, this is a really common one, is the grab brush. And I do use the grab brush a lot, and so the grab brush is right here. Now the grab brush, it's really easy to remember the shortcut. shortcut. The shortcut key is the G key, so just hit G for grab. That'll go to the grab brush. And for the grab brush, it's usually better if your brush is really big. So with the grab brush, instead of it sculpting the clay, it's going to pull around the clay. So if I kind of zoom way out here, make my brush really big, you can see I can pull the clay around. So this is super useful just for moving around the clay and changing the proportions of your sculpt. So if you're sculpting something like a face and then you realize maybe the proportions are a bit off, or maybe when you're first starting your sculpt, if you just want to play around with the base mesh, you can just kind of pull this around, and this brush is very useful. Now another useful brush, which is similar to the grab brush, but it is a bit different, is the snake hook brush. So if I change this over to the snake hook, now if I just click and drag here, you can see it's similar to the grab brush, but instead of it pulling around a large area, it's just going to pull around this small area, and I can kind of pop out this area, maybe bring this out. So it's going to kind of make sort of like a snake shape. Now another really useful feature for sculpting that you'll probably use a lot is the symmetry. So I've just brought back this original icosphere here, and let's say that you're sculpting like a face or a character or something which is symmetrical. And if you want one side to be mirrored over to the other side, what you can do is click on these buttons here. So these are the symmetry settings. You can see it kind of looks like a butterfly there, and the most common one you're going to use is the X. So if I turn on the X symmetry, now you can see as I move my brush here, you can see there's a little blue dot here, and then also another little blue dot on the other side showing you where it's going to mirror. So if I was sculpting a face here, you can see it's going to mirror on the other side. So that's how you can add symmetry when you are sculpting a character or a creature, or really anything which is symmetrical. And you can also turn on the X one and the Y one if you want to as well. You can see that's going to add the symmetry on the X, Y, and Z axis, but for most things, you're probably just going to use the X axis to symmetrize it back and forth. Now this happens for me a lot. Let's say I'm sculpting a face or something and I'm going to start to sculpt the eye, and then I realize that I forgot to turn on the symmetry. Well, what you can do is click on this little drop down arrow right here, and then there is a symmetrize setting, and you can see there is a direction, and most of the time you can just leave it at -X to +X, or you might need to change it from +X to -X, but I'm just going to leave this how it is, and then click on the symmetrize button. And what that did is it took the -X, which is over on this side, and then it mirrored it over to the +X, which is over on this side. And then of course, click on the X button here to turn on the X symmetry, and then you can continue to sculpt your character, and it will mirror it over to the other side. Now, I mentioned this earlier in the video, but if you have a very low poly mesh and you try to sculpt with this, let me just add a cube here and go to sculpt mode. You can see if I try to sculpt this, I can't really add much detail here. Even if I go to the clay strips brush and start to add clay here, start to sculpt, you can see it's not really doing anything except on the edges. And that is because this is a very low poly mesh. So you need a very high poly mesh like this object here. It's very high poly because the sculpt mode actually moves around the geometry of the mesh. But usually when you're sculpting, you're going to need to add more geometry as you're sculpting. Because let's say I'm going to pull out the mesh here. Let's just drag this up here. Let's say I'm maybe making a limb on a character or something. You can see as I pull this out here using the snake hook brush, you can see the geometry is being all stretched out. If I hit the tab key to go into edit mode, you can see the vertices and faces are being really stretched. So as you're sculpting, you're going to need to add more geometry as you sculpt. And there's two different ways to do that. And those two settings are right up here. So there's the Dyntopo and there is the remesh, and I'll show you how to use both of them. So first, let's go over the remesh. So you can remesh the sculpt as you are sculpting, and it's going to smooth out the geometry and it's going to even out the geometry. So let's say that I want to add more detail to this, because if I go here to the clay strips brush and then I start to sculpt here, you can see because all the faces are really stretched, it just looks really warped and weird. So what I can do is I can press the R key, and when I press the R key, a grid is going to show up, and I can drag my pen back and forth, and this will change the size of the remesh. So I'll just make it a bit smaller and then just click to place that there. Now I haven't actually remeshed it, so to remesh it now, I can press Control R, and Control R is going to remesh the sculpt, so you can see the sculpt still retains its shape. However, it's given lots more detail to the geometry, so now if I start to sculpt here, you can see the geometry is nice and smooth, and that looks much better. If I press the R key again and drag this grid here and make it really small and then press Control R, you can see it's going to be really low poly. So this is a really great workflow using the remesh. So as you're sculpting, you can occasionally press the R key, make it more detailed, then press Control R to remesh it, and then you can add more detail as you need it. So that's a really great workflow. Another really great workflow to sculpting is the Dyntopo. And the Dyntopo will add more geometry as you're sculpting. So if you're just sculpting in a specific spot and you're sculpting a really detailed area, it's just going to add more detail to that area. So to show you, I'm going to press the R key, make this a bit smaller, and then I'll press Ctrl R and it's going to remesh it. So you can see all the individual faces now. Well, if I click on this check mark here, and then I just need to click on OK, that is going to turn the Dyntopo on. So with the Dyntopo, if you click right here on the drop down, you can see there's going to be a detail size. So for example, I'll just turn this to like a 6 for now. So now if I start to sculpt here, you can see it's adding more geometry as I sculpt. If I hold down the Z button, that's going to bring up this pie menu, and I can move my mouse over to wireframe and then let go. You can also just click on this button here to go to wireframe, and you can see here's the geometry of the mesh. But where I've sculpted, you can see it's much more detailed, and if I just sculpt more and more, maybe zoom in a bit and then sculpt more and more, you can see it's going to be much more detailed. If I hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and let's just go back to solid view, you can see now it's more detailed where we have sculpted because of that Dyntopo. But then right over here, it's lower detailed. So let's go back into sculpt mode. You can see it actually turned the Dyntopo setting off. So I need to click on this check mark here and then click on OK. And then of course that detail is also controlled by the detail size. So let's say I wanted to make this much less detailed. So let's turn this detail size to like a 10. Now if I sculpt here, you can see the detail is a lot smaller. There is less detail because I've turned that size up. So if you turn this detail size down to a smaller number, then the faces are going to be smaller. Now I mentioned that if you zoom in closer and then sculpt, there's going to be more detail. Well, that is controlled by this setting right here, the relative detail. So if I click on the relative detail and then change it to constant detail instead, now I can zoom in and I can sculpt, and you can see it's super low detail. So on the Dyntopo settings, I need to change this resolution. So I'm just going to turn this resolution to like a 30 instead. Now if I sculpt here, you can see it's adding a detail level of 30, but if I zoom really far out and then sculpt, you can see the detail level is still going to be the same. Or if I zoom in really close and then sculpt, you can see the detail level is the same. So that is because we've set the detailing here to constant detail. But I like relative detail better because if I'm sculpting a really detailed area, I can turn it to relative detail, and that way if I zoom in, that area is going to be more detailed, and then if I zoom in more, it'll be even more detailed, but then if I zoom really far away, it's going to be less detailed. So that is super useful using the Dyntopo feature. So you can really use whichever method you like. You can use the remesh or the Dyntopo, and as you get better at sculpting, you'll find that sometimes some places are better for the remesh and others are better for the Dyntopo. So now that I've gone over the basic brushes and the basic tools, let's do a sculpting exercise by sculpting the cute fish character. So I'm just going to click right back here to go to the layout, and that'll take us back to object mode, and we can just delete this practice object. And let's now model a base mesh for the fish. So I'm first going to press Shift C to make sure that this 3D cursor here is in the center of the scene. So I'll now go to the add menu and I'm just going to add a cube. And I will hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and I'm going to go to the face select and I'll just select the front of the cube. And I will hit E to extrude. We're just going to extrude out the front of the cube a bit, and then extrude out again and kind of scale it down, and then bring it down on the Z axis and bring it over on the Y axis. Let's now hit tab to go back to object mode, and I'll press Ctrl 2 to add a subdivision surface with 2 levels, and I'll use the object context menu and click on shade smooth. You can also click on object and then click on shade smooth right there. And I'll hit tab to go back into edit mode, and I'm going to click right here on this button to go to the vertex select, and I will hold down the alt key and then select that loop of vertices there. And I will scale it up a bit, and I can also bring it back a bit, and then maybe press the A key to select the entire mesh and scale everything in just a little bit. Let's also click on this button here to go to the face select. We can select this face and maybe bring it out a bit and scale it down a little bit. So this is going to be the front of the fish, and this will be the back of the fish. So we'll select the back of the fish here, and we will hit the I key to inset that face, and then we can also scale it up on the Z axis, and then also scale it, and we'll hit X and scale it down on the X axis, and scale the whole thing down a bit. Then I will extrude it out, and we'll just extrude out a little bit, and then we'll extrude it out, and then scale it up on the Z axis, so hit S and then Z. We can scale it up, and then extrude it out again, just like that. Let's now hit tab to go back to object mode. That's going to be the base of the fish, so we'll now model the fins. So in object mode, I'm going to add a new object. So press Shift A for the add menu. Let's click here to add a cube, and I'll hit tab to go into edit mode, and I can hit G to grab and bring the cube over on the X axis, and then hit S to scale and scale it down on the Z axis, and then scale the whole thing down a bit. Let's hit tab to go back to object mode, and I can move the cube over and bring it down. And you can see because I was editing it in object mode, the origin point is still in the very center here. So if I click here to go to the modifiers, let's click on add modifier. I can click here for the search, and I will search for mirror. We'll add the mirror modifier so it's mirrored over to the other side because the mirror point is going to be from the origin. So I'll hit tab to go into edit mode, and I can bring it in here into the fish, maybe bring it down a little bit and bring it back a bit. And then if I hold down the Z button and go into wireframe view, I will hit A to deselect everything. I will click and drag just to box select that part of the fin, and I'll scale it down on the Y axis to make it pointy. Let's go back to solid view, and I will press Control R. Control R is going to add a loop cut, and I will left click and then right click so the loop cut stays where it is. And then if I select this vertex here, and then I'll hold down the Shift key and select this vertex here, I can hit G to grab and bring it out on the X axis and just make that fin longer. Maybe select everything with the A key and scale everything up on the Y axis. Then I can rotate it. Let's rotate it around. You can also double tap the R key, and that will enable the trackball rotation. And you can kind of rotate that down and bring it down a little bit, something like that. Let's hit tab to go back to object mode, and I'll press Control 2 to add a subdivision surface with 2 levels. And then we can hit tab to go back into edit mode, and I will press Control R to add a loop cut. I will left click and then drag this down over here, and then left click again right there. Hit tab to go back to object mode, and I will use the object context menu and then choose shade smooth. I use the right click select in Blender, so I hit the W key, but you can just right click and then click on shade smooth. Let's also now add like a fin on the top. So I will press Shift C to make sure the 3D cursor is in the very center there. I will go to the add menu and we'll add a cube. I'll press Control 2 to add a subdivision surface with 2 levels, and we'll bring the cube up, and then I will use the object context menu and shade it smooth. Then we'll go into edit mode, and I'm going to scale it down on the X axis and then also scale it down on the Z axis, and go back to object mode and move it over and bring it down here. And then I can select these 2 vertices and bring it back a bit, something like that. Select these 2 vertices and bring them back a little bit. Select everything and maybe scale it down on the Z axis or on the X axis like that. And then I can press Control R for a loop cut, and I can drag this down just to sharpen it and maybe scale everything down on the Z axis like that. All right, go back to object mode, and that's looking pretty good. So that's going to be the basic base mesh that we're going to use to sculpt, but I need to join this all together so that it's one object. So before I join an object together, I need to make sure that all the modifiers are the same or all the modifiers are applied. So what I'm going to do is click on the fins here, and if I open the side panel, you can see there's this mirror modifier. So let's click on the drop down arrow right here and click on apply. So if I go into edit mode, you can see it's actual geometry now. So now you can see that each one of these objects have the same subdivision surface modifier. So I'll select the fin, hold down the Shift key, select the other fin, and then hold down the Shift key and select the body last. And I will press Control J, and that's going to join it together into one object. Now I want to make this much more detailed, so here on the levels viewport and render, I'm going to click here to turn these up so it's very, very smooth, and I'm going to turn them up to like a 5 so it's really smooth. And then if I click on the drop down, I can click on apply to apply the modifier. So if I hit tab to go into edit mode, you can see the fish now is pretty detailed. So we can now go into sculpt mode. Before we do that though, let's save the project. So I'll click on file and click on save. And I'll just rename this to Fish Sculpt and then click on Save Blender File and just save that on my computer. So now we can click right here to go to Blender Sculpt mode, and it's going to take us into the sculpting mode here. And then also we have all the tools and the brushes. Now before we start sculpting this, if I zoom in here and I go inside the sculpt, you can see that there is mesh which is overlapping. We definitely don't want this because if I start to sculpt here, you can see there's going to be some really weird issues where the mesh is overlapping because they are 2 different meshes. So what I'm going to do is use Blender's remesh feature to actually remesh this all together so that it is one object and it will connect and it won't be 2 different pieces of the object. So again, to use the remesh, you can press the R key and then you can drag your mouse here and then just click when it is pretty high quality. So I'm going to make it about that high quality, and then you can press Control R, and that's going to remesh it. So now you can see if I zoom in here, you can see it's connecting. If I go into edit mode, you can see the mesh is connecting. And also if I go inside here, you can see there isn't any overlapping faces or any objects which are separate. So it's all just one object. So now we can start to sculpt this. Now, as I talked about earlier, we want to turn on the symmetry so it mirrors our sculpting from one side over to the other side. So we're going to click on this X right here. So now you can see there's that little blue dot there. So if I sculpt on this side, it's going to mirror it over to the other side. But I'll press Control Z to undo that. Now, before I sculpt this, there is another setting that I want to turn on. If I click here on the brush and click on this drop down, there's going to be a bunch of different brush settings. What I want to do is go all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to turn on this front faces only, so I'll check mark that. If this is turned off, let me just show you what can happen. So if this is turned off and I'm like sculpting here, you can see that it might start to sculpt on the other side, and it won't sculpt just from the front faces. And you can see it just happened right here. You can see I was sculpting right here, but as I was sculpting right here, these faces were really close because this is a pretty thin part of the mesh. It's pretty thin here. So these faces started to be pulled along with my sculpting, and so it messed up the mesh. So let me just press Control Z to undo that. So if I click on the brush drop down and then choose front faces only, it's going to only sculpt the front of the faces. And this in here, inside the mesh, that's the back of the face, but out here, that's the front of the face. So now if I start to sculpt here, if I sculpt along here, now you can see we're not having that issue. Even if I sculpt on this part, which is like really close, you can see it's only going to sculpt on the front faces. If I sculpt like this, it's kind of grabbing both of the faces, so that is kind of messing it up. So I'll press Control Z to undo that. But if I just sculpt right here on this front part, here are the fin, you can see it's not affecting the back of the mesh. But I'm going to press Control Z just to undo all that sculpting, because that was just an example. Now, something to be aware of is that if I click here onto a different brush setting and then click on the brush here, then you can see I might need to turn on the front faces only again. So if you're having issues with that, if you're sculpting and you realize that it kind of pulled some of the back of the mesh, then just make sure that this brush front faces only is turned on, because if you switch to a different brush, it might be turned off. So let's start by using the grab brush to add some details to the fins. So you can hit the G key, or you can click here to go to the grab brush. And for the grab brush, I really don't need the front faces only to be on. That's not important because I'm pulling around the mesh, so I don't need to worry about that. And then again, you can change the strength right here and the radius. I'm going to make the radius smaller by either dragging here, or you can press the F key and then drag over and then click there to make it a bit smaller. So let's now use the grab brush to pull out some cool details. So right here on this fin, I'm going to click and drag to kind of pull this out a bit. And then right here, I can kind of push this in. And then right here, I can kind of push this in. And then here at the end, I can kind of push that out a bit. And also click here and kind of tap along on my pen, on my tablet to kind of push that out. Let's also do the same thing on the back here. So if I go to the back, I can kind of pull this out here, maybe zoom out a bit, pull this out, then zoom in a little bit and kind of pull it out even more to kind of sharpen it up. And then right here, I can kind of tap here just lightly and kind of push that in a little bit. And then back here, or kind of on the end, I can zoom in and tap along here just to pull out that area like that. And then right up here, I can kind of tap along here to kind of pull that out there. So now you can see already we have some really cool details to our fish. And as you're sculpting, you can press Control S to save the file, or you can click on File and just click on Save to save your project. And of course, you can see right over here, it's done it for the other side because we have the symmetry on. So now let's do the same thing for the fin here, the top fin. So I'll just kind of tap along here to kind of pull out this area, and then I can click and drag or tap along there on my tablet to kind of push that in. Then I can pop this out here. Then I can push this in a bit, and then I can kind of pull this part out here. Maybe I can even pull this back a bit so it's a bit more round. Maybe even bring this down a little bit. All right. And then maybe here, kind of push this out so that it's a little bit bigger up here. Maybe pull this part out here and push this in there. So there we go. You can already see it's looking more like a stylized fish. You can also kind of pull around this part here if you want to kind of change the front or the face of the fish if you want to. Maybe even kind of pull this out just to make it a bit more smooth and round. And you can just change the proportions. Now is a good time to change the proportions before we add more details. And if this is looking a little bit stretched, we might as well remesh it. So press the R key, and that's going to bring up the remesh setting. I can't see it, so I need to zoom out. Press the R key, and I can drag this around. And I want this to be pretty detailed, so maybe like click right there, and then press Control R, and that's going to remesh it. So now Now if I hold down the Z button and move my mouse over to the wireframe and then let go, you can now kind of see how detailed that is, and it fixed any geometry that we kind of pulled around. Now let's also hold down the shift key, and remember holding down the shift key is going to go to the smooth brush, or you can also just click on the smooth brush by clicking right here. But I'm just going to hold down the shift key, and then I can just lightly smooth this out here, lightly smooth this out around here, just to kind of smooth out where the fins are connecting to the body. Maybe hold down the shift key and lightly smooth that out there and there. All right, and then also we can go right up here and lightly hold down the shift key and just press down very lightly and just kind of smooth that out there and smooth that out there. So now let's sculpt in the eye sockets. And for sculpting in the eye sockets, I like to use the clay strips brush. And I'll press the F key to make my brush a bit smaller. And let's just zoom in right here. And then instead of pushing out the clay by sculpting, I'm gonna hold down the control key and then sculpt, and that's gonna push in the clay. And I'm just gonna go around in circles here and just kind of push in where the eyes are. So that's looking pretty good. I like how that is. You can make it a little bit bigger if you want to. So just going around here in circles and kind of pushing in where the eye sockets are. And then let's also press Control R just to remesh it again, so it adds a bit more detail to that area. Go along there, and then hold down the Shift key, and you can just lightly smooth that out where you've sculpted. All right, so that's pretty good. If you want to hit the G key for the grab brush, you can also kind of play around with the shape of it if you want to like make it a little bit bigger, or kind of pull the eyes closer together or something like that. But that's looking pretty good. So we're going to add a different object in here, which is going to be kind of a cartoony eye. You can also, while you're still using the grab brush, you can kind of pull this down and maybe shape the fish a little bit, kind of shape the front of the fish if you want to. So now I want to carve in the mouth, and to carve away the mouth, I can use the crease brush. So I'm going to click right here to go to the crease brush. I'll press the F key to make my brush smaller, and I can just find a spot here, and then I can go along here and I can start to crease that in. Let's also click and drag here to make the strength of it a little bit bigger, and then I can go along here and start to crease in where that mouth is. All right, so something like that, crease that in there. Maybe hold down the Shift key and kind of smooth out the bottom lip there. All right, so that's a bit better. Kind of crease that in there, and then just crease along there. Try to keep it kind of smooth, and then hold down the Shift key, and you can just kind of smooth that out a little bit. Maybe zoom out a little bit and smooth it out a bit more. And then also let's crease down here. All right, so it comes over and then comes down. You can also press Control R again, and that'll kind of remesh it so it has a bit more detail. And then you can hit the G key for the grab brush, and you can kind of pull this around if you want to change the shape of it. So maybe I'll like push this down a little bit and kind of pull up the nose a little bit, just so there's kind of a subtle bump there. And then you can kind of change the smile or change the shape of the mouth. So something like that. I want him to maybe be smiling a little bit more, so I can kind of pull up that mouth there. And right here, I actually want to pull in the mouth, so I'll just use the grab brush and kind of just pull in that mouth so it's a little bit more thin. Now what I'm also going to do is click here to go to the clay strips brush, and then I can go along here and just lightly add a little bit more clay, and then hold down the Shift key and lightly smooth that out there. Let's go back here to the crease brush, and then I can just crease this in just a little bit. Now I want to do some more detailed sculpting for the gills and the scales. So what I'm going to do is stop using the remesh feature now, and I'm going to use the Dyntopo feature. So this will add geometry as I sculpt, and if I'm sculpting in a more detailed area, it'll add more geometry. So I'm going to click on this check mark here and then just click on OK. Let's also press Control S to save this file again. So now the Dyntopo is turned on. And I'm going to click right here to go to the clay strips brush. And if I click right here on the Dyntopo settings, the detail size is 10. Let me just sculpt along here and see how that is. I think I'll press Control Z to undo that. Let's turn the Dyntopo down even smaller to maybe just like a 5. So now I'll press the F key to make my brush a bit smaller, and I'm going to start by sculpting kind of little gill. So I will go along here and just add a bit of clay and kind of sculpt in like a gill there. All right, like that. And then also right here, just sculpt it a little bit. All right, go along there, just add a bit of clay there. And then I will hold down the Shift key, and holding down the Shift key is going to go to the smooth brush, and I can just smooth that out there, but I'm going to leave this part here because that's going to be the gill. And then if I want to crease this a bit, I can go to the crease brush, and I can just go along here and just crease it in just a little bit, maybe turn down the strength so it's not quite as strong, and just crease that in a little bit. Now remember, if you hold down the control key, it's going to do the opposite effect. So if I want to pinch this out and kind of sharpen it, I can hold down the control key with the crease brush and just kind of pinch that in, and that's going to kind of pull it out and kind of pinch it a little bit. Now you can see we have that little ridge there, and then if you don't hold down the control key and just sculpt, that's going to pinch that in. All right, so there we go. We have kind of a little simple gill. And now I'm going to go along here and I'm going to sculpt some scales. So I'll go back here to the clay strips brush, and I'm just going to go along here and kind of make these little like backwards C shapes, or kind of like half moon shapes, and then go along here to fill it, and then hold down the shift key and kind of smooth that. All right, let's go down here and do it again. So go along here, add that little kind of half moon shape, and then hold down the shift key and smooth that out there. Go along here, add another one. All right, hold down the shift key, smooth that out there. We can just start to make a cool pattern there for some stylized scales. And then let's add some more scales. So this time I'm going to start the scales on the center of the other one, so we can add another layer of scales. And this one is going to go up there and then end on the other top of that layer of scales. So go along there. You can also smooth this out if you kind of added too much detail there. All right, and then kind of fill this in, and then just smooth that out by holding down the shift key. All right, and then this one here, we can start it right here and it can come up and then go back down. Bring that out more, and then hold down the shift key and kind of smooth that out a bit more, like that. All right, so now we have some more scales. Let's also add maybe another like half one there, and then just hold down the shift key and smooth that out there. And then we'll add another half one kind of right there, which is kind of ending. All right, add more clay, and then hold down the shift key and smooth that out there. And then we'll add another one here, so go up and down. All right, around there, hold down the shift key and smooth that out. And then right up here, we'll add another one. So this one will go up and then kind of end right over there. And then hold down the shift key and smooth that one out as well. You can also hit the G key for the grab brush, and then you can kind of pull this around if you want them to like pop out a bit more, or if you just want to kind of play around with the shape of them. All right, that's pretty good. And then another thing you can do is you can go to the crease brush. So back to the crease brush. If you want to, you can hold down the control key and you can kind of pinch that out just to make it even more visible. So you can kind of pinch out the edges there of the scale. So just kind of pinch out those edges of the scales so they're a bit more visible. So I'm just going to keep on doing that and add a bit more scales to the rest of the fish. Then holding down the shift key, smoothing that part out there. We can go along here, add another one. And if you'd rather, what you could do without smoothing them out is you could first just sculpt all of them. So like sculpt that one there, and that one there. And then once you're done sculpting it, then you can smooth all of them out. If you want to do that, that might be a bit easier. And then we'll add another one kind of coming up here. Then we'll add another one right there, one more right there, and then maybe another like half one going off to the bottom of the fish. Just going around kind of in circles while holding down the shift key to smooth that out. And I'll just do a few more layers of these scales. All right, and I'm going to call that done for those scales there on the fish. Now another detail that I want to add is kind of like some creases here on the fins. So I'll go to the crease brush, and we still have the Dyn Topo on, so it'll add more geometry as we sculpt. And I'll just go along here, maybe actually make my strength quite a bit bigger, make the strength a bit stronger, and I'll go along here and just add some little lines here, just to add a bit more detail. I think that's pretty cool. Adding some lines there, just along those fins. And then we can go up here to the top, and we can do like the same thing. So go along there and just add a bit of details to the fins all along there. All right, that's kind of cool. And then also let's go to the very end here, or the very back. So the tail. And I can go along there, maybe add another one right up here, and then down here, add another one. And then we can just kind of fill those all in by adding more of those lines. So it just adds a cool detail to that kind of cartoony stylized fish. And there we go, that really adds a lot to the fish. And then another cool setting that I wanted to show you with the brush settings is if you click here on stroke, this will change the stroke of the brush. And right now it's set to space. So this is basically going to add little kind of stamps of the brush, but the spacing is set to 10. So you're not really going to be able to notice it. If I turn the spacing way up now, if I make it like a really big spacing, now if I click and drag, you can see there's going to be a big space before it makes that little stamp there. So what I can do is I can click right here to go to the draw brush, and then I can make the strength a lot bigger. Then if I click here on the stroke settings of this one, let's maybe just turn the spacing up a little bit, maybe to just like 90. And now if I go along here, you can see it's going to add some little dots there. So that's pretty cool. So that's just another useful tool. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. So let me go back to the stroke and let's turn up a little bit more, maybe like 150. And then if I kind of go along here, you can see I can add some little dots. So maybe I'll like zoom way into kind of the cheeks of the fish, and then I can make my brush really small and I can just go along here and add some dots, although that spacing is a little bit too close. So again, let me just take the stroke spacing and turn that up to maybe like 200 or 300, and then I can just go along here. And you could also just click and tap if you wanted to, but this is a cool way to quickly add some more details. So that's kind of cool. If you wanted to add like a bit of a pattern there or some details on the fish, you could do that. And while we're on the stroke settings, you can also change the stroke method. So on default, it's set to space, but another cool one you could choose is you could do like the line instead. So let's change this to line. And then back on the stroke settings, we'll turn the spacing way down just to around the default, which is about 10. And so if I use the line, if I click and drag here, you can see it's going to show me a line. And then when I let go, it's going to sculpt the line there. So that is pretty cool. You could add some cool details. Maybe it's not the best for this fish model. I don't really know what I would add to it, but if you wanted to kind of create some lines, you could do that with the line stroke. So that's going to be it for the sculpting. So I'm going to call this done for now. So I am going to show you how you can do some cool painting and you can actually paint some colors on this fish. But before I do that, I want to model the eyes. So I'm going to click here to go back to the layout, and I will press Ctrl S to save the project. And I'm just going to use my mouse and keyboard for this just to model the eye. So I'm going to press Shift C to make sure the 3D cursor is in the very center of the scene, and I'll go to the add menu and I'm just going to add a UV sphere. And I'll bring the UV sphere forward on the y-axis, and then I can hit tab to go into edit mode, and I can scale it down, and I can move it here and just move it inside where the fish's eye is. And then let's also click here on add modifier here in the modifiers, and I'm going to search for mirror and we'll add the mirror modifier. And then I can double tap the R key, and double tapping the R key will use the trackball rotation, and I'm just going to rotate this around so the fish is kind of looking forward like that. And then I can kind of scale that down and just stick the eye there in the eye sockets. That's a bit too far out, so maybe just bring that back a little bit. And then I'll hit tab to go back to object mode, and I'll use the object context menu and shade that smooth. And then also let's press Control 2. Control 2 is the shortcut key for adding a subdivision surface modifier so it's more smooth. Let's go back into edit mode, and I maybe can scale this up a bit. And then I want to add kind of a little bump for like the iris or the pupil. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key and then just select that loop right there. And then I can hold down the Shift and Alt key and select that loop right there. And then just hold down the Shift key and select that vertex right there. And I can hit E to extrude, and then hit S to scale and maybe make it a little bit smaller. And then what I can also do is add a loop cut to kind of sharpen this up. So I'll press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, and I can click and drag over, and then just click to place that there. So if I go back to object mode now, you can see we have a cute eye there for our fish. Let's press Ctrl S to save this, and then we can hold down the Z button and we can go down into the material preview just to see what the materials look like. And we can create a material for the eye. So we'll select the eye. Let's click here on the materials. Let's click on new to add a new material. And I can just call this white. And then here on the roughness, we'll turn that to 0. So it's really shiny. And on the base color, I'll make this fully white. Now I just want to add a dark area where the center of the eye is. So I will hit the tab key to go into edit mode. I'm going to hit A to deselect everything. I will hold down the Alt key and select that loop there. And then hold down the Shift and Alt key and select that loop. And hold down the Shift and Alt key and select that loop. And then if you just hold down the Shift key, you can select the center vertex. So we'll now click on the plus here to add a new material. Let's click on new, and I can click on this to rename it, and I'll rename this to black. And then we can click on the assign button, and that will assign that black material to just those faces. So I will hit tab to go back to object mode, and then if I click on the base color on the black material, we'll make it fully black, and I can take the roughness and turn it all the way down so it is shiny. So now we have some cute cartoony eyes. So now we can do some painting here on the fish. So I'm going to go back to Blender Sculpt mode, and Blender Sculpt mode actually has a painting mode. Now, it's not exactly the same as texture painting, where you're texture painting on a texture and then you're UV unwrapping the texture onto the object. This mode for texture painting actually uses the vertices or the detail of the mesh to paint the different colors. So I'm going to scroll my mouse down here and you can see that there's a paint mode. So I'm going to click on the paint mode, and then for the painting, I'm going to bring back my drawing tablet. So if you're in the paint mode, you can see right up here, there is this black one and then this white one here, but the black one is the main color. So if I click on this color, I can make it whatever color I want with the color wheel. So I'm going to make it like a red color. And then the same settings apply for the brush. So you can see there's the brush strength and the radius. I'll press the F key to make the radius bigger. And then I can start to go along here and I can paint. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't actually a texture map. This is just using the detail of the geometry to paint this. So if you're trying to paint this using a very low poly model, then it's not going to work correctly and it's not going to be very detailed. But because this object is really detailed and it has lots of geometry, we're actually painting on the vertices, and each vertex or each face is going to be a different color. So it works well for just quickly doing some basic coloring to the model. So now that I've painted this in all with the red, I'm going to click here on the color wheel and I'm going to change this to a bright yellow color. And then I can also click here to make my brush stronger. And I can zoom in, and then I can go along here and I can paint this, and I can paint it in yellow. And again, here we have the symmetry turned on with the X there, so it's going to be mirrored over to the other side. So I can just go along here and I can just paint along here, paint in yellow. That's pretty cool. And then let's click on the color again, and this time I'm going to change it to like an orangey color, and I'll make my brush less strong. And I will go along here and just paint a little bit of an orange color. Maybe make the orange color a little bit more towards the yellow, and just paint a little bit of orange here along where the scales are. And also maybe along here, paint that a bit of orange, and down here, make that a little bit orange. And also the belly of the fish, I thought that'd be fun to make it a bit orange. All right, something like that. And then maybe on the back here, we could make a little bit of orange here along the back fin. So something like that is pretty cool. So I will now click on the layout to go back to the layout view. Now you can see in the layout, if you hold down the Z button and go to the material preview, or click on this button to go into the material preview, or if you hold down the Z button and go into the rendered view to see what this actually looks like when it's rendered, you can see that it's not actually showing the colors. And that's because we needed to do a very simple setup in the materials to tell it to use those colors that we painted. So I'm going to click here to go to the shading workspace, and this is going to go into the shader editor, and we need to add a material to the fish. So we'll just click on new here to add a new material, and here I can just type in fish just to call this fish. So then these here are the shader nodes. If you don't know how to use the procedural shader nodes, I have lots of tutorials on how to use the shader nodes. You can of course check out my Blender for Complete Beginners tutorial series, and you can also check out my Blender Beginner Fundamentals playlist, where I have many different videos on different parts of Blender. But this is basically the principled shader. If I hold down the Z button and move my mouse into the material preview, this is the shader. So you can see I can like change the roughness, and you can also like change the color. But what I'm going to do is just add in a node here which has the color data that we painted. So I'll press Shift A for the add menu, and I'm going to start to type in attribute, and we can go here to the color attribute. So we'll click on the color attribute, drop it here, and then if I click on this right here, we can choose this color, and this is the one that we painted. Now we can take these wires here and I can plug the color wire into the base color. So instead of it using the base color, which is one single color, it's now going to use the colors that we painted in the painting sculpt mode. So I can now click back here to go to the layout, and then I'll just do a few things to make this look really nice in the 3D view. So I'll click here to go to the render properties, and I'm going to scroll down here, and on the color management, I'm going to click on the look here and change this to very high contrast to kind of pop up the colors and make them look more saturated. And then if you just want to change the viewport lighting, you can click on this drop down here. If you're in the material preview mode, you can click around here, and then you can click on this here, this little circle, and this is going to give you some different HDRI lightings, so you can change this around to something that looks nice. And then you can also maybe turn the strength down if you don't want it to be quite that strong. And then one more thing you can do, if you select the fish and click here to go to the materials, you could make the fish look a bit more reflective by dragging this roughness down, and now you can see the fish looks a bit more shiny and reflective. And there we go, we now have a nice, cute, stylized 3D fish sculpt. So that's going to wrap it up for this tutorial. So that is the basics of how to do sculpting in Blender for beginners. So I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you found it helpful, and thank you for for watching. And you can also purchase the finished project files for free on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. The links are in the description. And also my Gumroad store and Patreon page are great ways to help support this channel. And on my Gumroad store and Patreon page, you can get access to lots of Blender content like 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, procedural materials, geometry node modifier setups, and lots more Blender content on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. And if you really enjoy sculpting and you want to get more into sculpting in Blender and learn more about sculpting, then you can check out my Blender sculpting tutorial playlist on my YouTube channel, where I have many more sculpting tutorials. So I have specific videos on some of the tools and some of the workflows, and then I also have some follow along tutorials where you can learn how to sculpt some different sculptures. And if sculpting is something that you really want to get good at and something that you really want to get into, then I can highly recommend checking out CG Boost's Master Sculpting in Blender course. That's a really big course and it goes into so much more detail, and you'll learn so much more about sculpting in Blender. And if you purchase it through my affiliate link, then I'll earn a small commission, but with no extra cost to you. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.